Hello, my name is Natalie Elliott, and my presentation is Toxicity in Gaming Culture and the Information Behavior of Video Game Players. LIS has seen an increased interest in video games and gaming, with some libraries beginning to build game collections, use games as a source of community building, and recognizing video games as sources of user recreation and academic study. Video games are historically underrepresented in the LIS field, leaving gamers' information needs unmet and requiring them to turn to non-traditional information sources. In gaming culture, there is a high occurrence of toxic and negative online behaviors during player interactions while gaming or discussing games, and through the spread of mis- and disinformation in gamers' information sources. There are many kinds of toxic behaviors. We can define toxic behaviors in two predominant groups. There are harassment types, which include trolling, verbal bullying, doxing, swatting, and griefing, the latter of which is characterized by intimidation, retaliation, and sabotaging or interfering in another's gameplay. And then there are deception types, which include stealing, cheating, scamming, misleading or baiting other players, and spreading misinformation and disinformation. Studies on toxicity in gaming began in the mid-90s in disciplines outside of LIS, consisting of definitions and typologies of toxic behaviors, player personalities, and motivators for engaging in toxicity. LIS interest began in the late 2000s, when video games began to be seen as information-rich spaces with users that had underserved information needs. Currently, there are a few studies done on gamers' information behavior, and those are limited to multiplayer gamers, with no studies done on the information behaviors of single-player gamers. There are no studies done on toxic behaviors and how they impact gamers' information behavior in either single or multiplayer settings, leaving a large information gap. Toxic behaviors are most common in multiplayer games and gaming forums, and the exact cause of engagement in these behaviors is unclear. There are likely many factors, such as perceptions that online anonymity means that there are no consequences for their actions, amusement, catharsis, empowerment and control, in-game gains, superiority, and thrill. Toxic behaviors are frowned upon within the gaming community, causing players to feel a variety of negative emotions. In 2021 and 2022, studies found that in multiplayer gaming, 3 out of 4 players witnessed various types of harassment, while 2 out of 3 players experienced harassment. In response, players will leave or quit the game, ignore the behavior, call out or report the toxic player, and even record the encounter to post on forums or social media. These attitudes and responses suggest a significant impact on players' information behaviors. Team gaming has some of the highest rates of toxic encounters, which have been found to be contagious, being spread by more experienced players and often directed at a player's own teammates. When young or new players witness the normalization of these behaviors, they internalize and spread them to other players, continuing the cycle of toxicity. This is a serious concern for library events involving video games if the games are being used as community building tools. There are a few studies done on mis- and disinformation and multiplayer gamers, and no studies done on single-player gamers. So there's very little known about how gamers encounter, identify, share, and react to the presence of mis- and disinformation in gaming information sources. The few studies done suggest that players tend to feel animosity toward the game developers who know more about the game and the future of the game than players do. This knowledge gap leads to information asymmetry, which players attempt to balance with speculation, wishful thinking, and false information, which is often picked up and disseminated as factual by other gamers and even gaming news websites. There are many unofficial gaming information sources of dubious nature. The sheer volume and variety, paired with their unknown veracity, may lead to information overload, lowering gamers' inhibitions when making decisions and sharing information. Disinformation in the form of extremist ideologies is also a serious problem, particularly in multiplayer games and gaming forums. Players' exposure to extremist ideologies in these settings rose from 8% of players in 2021 to 20% in 2022. The goal of this research is to understand toxicity in gaming culture and information seeking by addressing the information gap on the relationship between and impact of toxicity on information behaviors and encounters and responses to mis and disinformation, as well as the difference between the single player and multiplayer settings rates of encounter with toxicity and mis and disinformation, and how these players encounter, identify, share, and react to mis and disinformation. The research questions for this study are: how do toxic online behaviors impact source preferences in information seeking on games? How does the single or multiplayer setting of video games affect players' information seeking behaviors? Are players of single or multiplayer games more likely to encounter misinformation and disinformation when seeking information? A snowball sampling will be used to recruit participants through gaming forums. Participants must be over 18 and identify as gamers. There is a possibility that potential participants will be skeptical of my intentions. Transparency about the research will be key to reducing their hesitancy. The study will use a mixed methods approach with a closed-ended online anonymous survey and semi-structured interviews over email or on Zoom. Informed consent will be obtained for the survey through the introduction page. For the interviews, participants will be emailed an informed consent document. Limitations include possible underrepresentation of single or multiplayer gamers, providing compensation, and the length of time of the interviews, which could impact response rate and absolute size of the population sample. It's possible that some gamers could lie about their age with no clear way to verify that parental consent was obtained. Because the survey is not exhaustive, some participants' experiences may not be represented. Self-reporting in the interviews may allow participants to misrepresent their experiences. The survey will provide quantitative data. Descriptive statistics will be used for measures of central tendency, frequency, and variance. Bivariate comparisons will be used to compare single-player to multiplayer gamers with a possible analysis of variance test. The interviews will provide qualitative data. Interview data will be used to ground the quantitative data with self-reports on search process and experiences. Relational analysis will be used to examine the relationships between players' experiences with toxicity and mis and disinformation. In vivo software will be used to integrate the survey and interview data, code relationships, and create visualizations. Bar charts will be used for comparing experiences with toxicity in single and multiplayer settings. Pie charts will be used to give order to source preferences and types of toxic encounters. Tables will be used to display coding categories and the relationships between setting, search methods, and encounters with toxicity and mis and disinformation. This research will allow for better understanding of how players search and reroute information seeking based on toxic encounters. Understanding how users encounter, identify, and respond to the spread of mis and disinformation provide grounds for further investigation on teaching methods for identifying and addressing mis and disinformation, and is conducive to the goal of inclusion through greater knowledge of gaming culture, which could inform collection development, readers, or in this case, gamers advisory, and begin discussions on strategies to reduce toxicity in community gaming events. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you found it interesting and informative.